educators and students and activists, all who have a vision of fighting for social change, and not only do you have a vision, but you have a commitment to making that happen. I feel like me as a person, as a representative of my union, I am a little symbol of change and hope, because I ran for president on with a caucus called Educators for Democratic Union, which ran on a progressive slate of a commitment to democracy, member empowerment, and a commitment to social justice unionism. In Spanish, they say la tercera es la vencida. We ran 3 times, but this time our candidate for president won. A great surprise to many, including myself. But in any case, I'm happy to say that there are changes underway, some bigger, some smaller. The union is turning outwards and building our capacity. We launched an internal membership organizing campaign in which we're trying to support members at every single school in their ability to stand up for themselves and for their own students. We formed a handful of committees in the effort to link our union directly to struggles in the community. So we formed a housing committee, a Black Lives Matter committee, a testing committee, and an immigrants' rights committee. And we're going to be putting those committees into action soon enough. And a small, but maybe significant thing that happened 2 weeks ago. Our union assembly is the highest body of our union, and we voted 2 weeks ago to revoke the endorsement of Mayor Lee. Our union had endorsed Mayor Lee back in May, and many, many members did not understand why we were doing that. Okay, so with that, I want to say where there's hope, that opens the door for collective action. Where there's collective action, there will be change. We can see it here. Thank you very much.
Let's give another big round of applause for Lita Blanc, president of the UESF. So, I'm Jeffries. I'm a first grade teacher. I've been a first grade teacher for 18 years.
I'm Zapata. I've been teaching for the last 19 years. I teach high school this year. First of all, I want to say a thank you to Eric Gutherns. Eric, where are you? Stand up. Let's hear it for Eric. He's a principal here at Mission High School. I also just want to say a thank you to Richard Carranza, the superintendent, who's helped us quite a bit. We wouldn't be able to pull off the conference without the support that the district gives us, truly, in a lot of financial ways. And so, my name is Karen Zapata. I teach 10th and 12th grade English at Berkeley High School. Any jackets? I've been a teacher for the past 18 years, and I helped found Teachers for Social Justice way back, and I'm super excited and inspired to see what has become both of our organization, as well as the way this conference has unfolded over the years. It's a place to build community, to find the ganas and the juice, to keep on keeping on. And today we're going to do an activity in the true T4SJ way of getting to know the people around you and connect so that we can continue our work together in this beautiful struggle. So first, I want you to take a minute to think of someone who, to you, is a social justice educator. So just take a second to think. Why would you call them a social justice educator? Why do you respect them? Okay. Now you're going to turn and talk, and you're going to talk to someone near you, someone that you do not know, and you might have to lean over someone or switch seats or turn around and talk to someone, and you're going to share who that person you chose is and why. Go. what I do in my classroom, but I don't do any of that clap once stuff. I'm not going to get you to clap once and clap twice. You're just going to stop talking, please. All right. So, we're going to move on, people. I hope you've built some community. I really want to encourage you to check in with that person later if you can find them and if you see them. So you just connected with someone new, and see if you can kind of circle back to them later. You might want to meet each other at lunch or something. We wanted to do this, but then it sounded too datey, so no datey stuff here. We want to recognize Genevieve, our translator, our ASL translator. It's our first year. We're working very hard on accessibility. If you have any suggestions for us, please, or if you want to step up and help us out with accessibility, we'd appreciate that. Our next, we're excited to have, we're excited to have our young folks, our young keynotes, do our opening today, it's not tonight, this morning. And Kelly Clark, who is a 5th grade teacher at Harvey Mill Elementary, is going to come up and introduce the young folks.
Well, I don't have much to say. I'm actually here to introduce 2 students that were once in my classroom. And I teach at Harvey Mill Civil Rights Academy. So our platform is an ideas around civil rights and social justice. And I'm going to introduce to you 2 wonderful, intelligent, profound little girls, or young ladies, Shavonne and Xaria. Let's give it
My name is Shavonne Hines-Foster, and I'm a 7th grader at Aptos Middle School.
Good morning. My name is Xaria Lubensky, and I'm a 7th grader at Everett Middle School. How was your day?
I'm here to give you my thoughts on social justice and how we can use it as a foundation. Social justice and how we can use it as a foundation. Ways we can implement social justice are challenge, unity, and art and social interaction. I feel as students we do not receive as much challenge as we need in academics. I feel if we have debates about miscellaneous topics, we will spark new dendrite branches in our brain, also sparking creative thinking. I feel that educators should further our thinking by asking questions related to our topics. Textbooks. I feel that educators do not tell the full stories inside the textbooks. I feel that educators should tell the stories of the triumphs, hardships, and stories in and out of the textbook. I feel that when teachers teach out the textbooks, they feel that they will overstep boundaries. If we can conform the textbook while also being truthful, we will reach a common ground.
Educators can use social justice to improve education. I believe that teachers should use equity. Educators have been using equality for years, but never have used equity. If educators used equity, we could improve education because the kids who were having trouble in school could get the support they needed. If educators used equity to improve education, the kids who weren't getting enough challenge could get the challenge they needed. If educators used equity, the kids who would not try their hardest could get the proper moral support to try. If educators used equity to improve education, They wouldn't have to worry about any of these problems anymore because each class would be individual to each student. Yes, this would take a long time, but as we are using more and more education technology these days, that shouldn't be much of a problem. Thank you.
Buenos dias. How are we feeling today? Let me go ahead and take these glasses off so I'm not nervous. Yeah, let's go ahead and give it up for our young people. Because in these kind of spaces, we need to have young people here, right? It's not just about the educators, right? Because our young people are teaching us a lot as well, so we need to remember that. So, my name is Pour-Khorshid. And I am a kindergarten bilingual teacher. I teach in the same community that I was born and raised in and continue to live in. I'm also a PhD student and hopefully will be graduating in the next 2 to 3 years. And I'm also a core organizer for the Teachers for Social Justice. So I'm here to do 2 things. One, to remind us of the context that we're currently teaching in and why it's so important for us to be unapologetic about the fact that we're teachers for social justice. Right? I'm saying that. But also, I'm here to kind of give you an overview of why your donations today are so critical in moving this work forward. So, as you take out your crumpled dollars, hint, hint, and as you take out your smartphones to get ready to donate on our website at T4SJ.org, I'm going to go ahead and run through this with you as we get ourselves together. Thank you so much, Stove. Let's give it up for Stove. David Stovall. All right, y'all. So we're currently teaching in a context where we literally have to proclaim that Black Lives Matter because our system has deemed our Black community as disposable. And so literally every 28 hours, we have a young Black person or old Black person who is killed by police and state-sanctioned violence. So as social justice educators, we don't replace Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter because that would be an erasure of the specificity of the struggle that our Black brothers and sisters are facing. But we're also teaching in a context where even in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, unfortunately, our Black women and sisters and trans women sisters have been largely excluded from this dialogue. So as we are teaching about the Black Lives Matter movement, we also need to make sure that as social justice educators, we're putting our Black young women and trans women at the forefront as well. Because when we forget them, that actually is a further act of violence. We're also teaching in a time where our immigrant communities are being detained, criminalized, and victimized by U.S. immigration policy based on mass incarceration and detention. So our U.S. imaginary and yet legal borders is a humanitarian crisis. So we've seen horrible images of our immigrant communities in very inhumane situations. And all because they were not able to qualify as American citizens based on arbitrary requirements set by our country. We're teaching in a context where school closures are disproportionately impacting low-income communities of color all over this country. And just as an example, our Chicago comrades just recently, last month, had Chicago in the house. just recently had to stage a 34-day hunger strike just to keep their public school, one of the very few that are still left in Chicago, open. And asking essential questions like, why do low-income minority students need to have their schools run by private contractors? Why can't our schools be anchored by the community? And why can't we have public schools? But we're also living and teaching in a context where parents are literally being criminalized and sentenced to serve years in prison just to move to another district or to put their children in another school with more resources and in schools that are supposed to be less segregated. We're currently, which you all are in this context now, teaching in communities that are being highly gentrified and essentially colonized. And some of you recall seeing this video that went viral, which happened just about a block and a half away from this current location, where a group of mostly white males working for Dropbox, who are essentially gentrifiers, let's just keep it real, went and approached a group of San Francisco natives, young people, and tried to force them to leave the field because they paid for a permit to play on it. So we need to remember, this is just one of many examples of the effects of gentrification and how our communities are being displaced, devalued, and criminalized and treated as outsiders in their own communities. And we're teaching in a time where for most marginalized students, the school-to-prison pipeline begins as early as elementary school. We teach in a system that essentially pushes out low-performing students of color through zero-tolerance school policies where students are suspended, expelled, arrested, and get a criminal record before they even hit puberty. A lot of us remember Ahmed in Texas, who was arrested for being excited about science and teacher bias translating into fear that it was a bomb. And we're also teaching in some contexts where we have a high reliance on police to maintain discipline in our schools, where even some of our colleagues act as police without the uniforms, with little to no training on how to deal with youth in humanizing ways, and where our country funds exponentially more on prisons than on education. So these are all just a few of so many examples of why it's so essential for us to understand our role in education and why we need to be committed to social and racial justice. So what does this mean? It means that we need to have the moral and political clarity of what our work is and what our role is. And so in the words of Paulo Freire, education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And let us be very clear that this is not an act of charity. We are not missionaries. We are working in solidarity with the communities that we teach in. And so in the words of Lila Watson, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. So I say all of this to say how your donations contribute to a larger movement to challenge a culture of violence through grassroots teacher professional development and organizing. The folks that you see in these pictures are all core organizers, and that means that everything that we do is volunteer. We don't get paid to do anything that we do, including all of the work that goes into this conference. Some of us are full-time teachers, some of us are school counselors, librarians, administrators, community educators, professors, and organizers. So essentially, what we aim to do is to create spaces, transformative spaces, for us to engage in this work more deeply. And some of that requires us to have some food, because we're hungry, y'all. When we get to these meetings, we are hungry. So some of it goes to that. But I want to be really transparent. You know, I was raised in a family that says don't put your family business out there, but I'm sorry, y'all, T4SJ, I'm going to put our family business out there. We're in the hole, y'all. Right now, we are in about $3,000 in the negative. okay, just for the work that we've put on this year. So it's really important for us to not charge a dime to anybody that comes here. Why? Because it needs to be accessible. This essentially is a labor of love. This is what it's supposed to be about. That's real. But, so although we don't want funds to be an issue for you all, the reality is it's an issue for us. So I want to be transparent and just give you a few examples of some of our costs. One would be, we pay about $500 just to put out the flyers that many of you have seen. I'm sorry I don't have one now to show you, but we do this for outreach purposes. We also pay about $3,500 to provide our conference free lunch, and we're very committed to working with community partners because that's just what we do here at T4SJ. And although we do not pay for our keynote speakers, we do pay for their stay and their flight, and we all know that living in a gentrified city, stay is not cheap. I'm just saying. So we also pay about $150 in tips for the janitors and folks and security guards that are working here and helping us out today. We pay about $50 for our parking attendant at Everett Middle School, about $640 for childcare workers, and we do this specifically because we want to be inclusive to our parents. They should be able to come and be fully included in all of these items for free. And of course, we have to pay for conference supplies, which usually is about $200. And all of the actual labor that we put out there is free as well. But after doing the math, which we were kind of modest on that, it was about 670 hours worked just to make this conference happen. But if paid by the San Francisco minimum wage, it would end up being about $7,300, not including benefits. So essentially, this whole conference just to happen today, it would cost about more than $12,000. And some of your donations will also go to the food that we provide for the people that come to our study groups, our 411 forums, and our mini conferences like the one we had earlier this year, the Hands Up and Teach. Some of your donations go to our Thank a Social Justice Teacher event. How many of you have ever experienced that event? Let's hear a hand clap if you've been there before. Awesome. And this is really essential for us because we should be praised. A lot of times we are reprimanded for teaching social justice lessons. So this is the space that we really want to uplift our social justice educators and congratulate them for the work that they're doing. Your donations also go to our annual retreat. Because this is really where the planning and revisioning and building happens for the year. And sometimes your donations also go to special issues that require us to sponsor specific events. Like earlier this year, we collaborated with our comrades in Arizona and we staged a teach-in right here at Mission High to basically protest and really it was in resistance to the ban on ethnic studies in Arizona. So essentially, every single dime that you donate today is somehow going to the work that we do to ensure that as social justice educators, we create spaces for us to resist the apolitical, ahistorical, and oftentimes uncritical professional development that we are dreadfully forced to sit through at our school sites. And in classrooms. I'm gonna keep it real. Sorry. So this is essentially what we have to do in order for us to have that political, moral, and pedagogical clarity on what we do in the classroom. So I just ask for you all today, as you give your donations, just remember that this is a labor of love, and so even if you can't come out to all of these events and help us to organize, your donations really essentially help us to move this work forward. So congratulations to you all for being here today and for wanting to participate in a larger movement.
Let's hear for Buddy. And let's hear for all of you that are donate now as the boxes come around. All right, so it's kind of a little, what is it? Non-secular? Something happening here? Okay, so if you can donate when the boxes come around, that would be awesome. And then we can get ourselves going for next year. We pay for the conference every year by what we fundraise today, so yes. Write checks to T4SJ. Yeah, please.
So we accept cash, check. We also have Square in the front that you can also donate. You can also donate online. One of the things we started this year was allowing people to become monthly sustainers. So you can say, I want to pay $10 a month to T4SJ, and it makes a big difference because it gives us a real base to build our work from. And so we appreciate everything you do. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm really excited today to. We had a unfortunately Imani Perry, the amazing keynote we had planned due to unforeseen circumstances, couldn't be with us. She's well and taking care of herself. She's fine, but she couldn't make it. So last night I gave a call to the amazing Kevin Kumashiro, who's our keynote and we were holding off because next year he was going to be our main keynote. We were going to do we'd be honored if you join us, but then I had to do it last night on the phone. So I do want to introduce him though and say that I first met Kevin many years ago when I heard about this organization called the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education over in the East Bay. And this was before Kevin's time at the University of Illinois in Chicago, when he was the professor and coordinator of Asian American Studies, and before he chaired the Department of Educational Policy Studies, and before he became the dean of the School of Education at UESF. Yes. And before all the books he published and articles and all that stuff. But Kevin had founded the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education and was doing work that was very similar to T4SJ, helping educators build their analysis around oppression and then doing the hard work of helping us, all of us, change our practice. When I met him, though, I was mostly struck by how small he was. But then, what was so noticeable about Kevin, really, on meeting him, was the immensity of his heart. We need people like Kevin in our work. Kevin understands the complexities of building humanizing educational spaces. Spaces that challenge our system of education. Kevin gets that in order to teach, you must find places of vulnerability and connection, and that being real and showing up with a full heart is critical. Kevin knows that we need the arts in our educational spaces, and building a culture of support for teachers is critical, while challenging us to change is essential. And most of all, Kevin's vision, rooted in fierce but loving kindness, is why I'm excited to bring him to the stage. So let's hear it for Kevin Kumashiro.
Thank you so much. That was such a flattering introduction, and I'm so pleased to be able to join this conference. Sorry, I think I dropped the pen, but no worries. Let me begin by thanking and really giving a shout out to the amazing presenters that came before me, as well as to Imani Perry. I hope you're doing well, and I hope I do justice to your time slot. I also want to thank T4SJ and particularly Jeremiah Jeffries and Karen Zapata for all your amazing leadership and for inviting me to be a part of this event. As I was getting ready for this event, of course, I can't not think about the resignation of Arnie Duncan. And part of what I'm thinking about is, as we hear the rhetoric around the resignation of the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, what we hear is claims that he is arguably the most impactful of the Secretaries of Education that we've had. And he's now completing 7 years. He's the 9th Secretary of Education, one of the longest serving, and I would argue he actually is arguably the most impactful of the Secretaries of Education. Under Duncan's administration, we have changed how we think about funding for education. We've moved away from formula grants that target inequities to competitive grants that incentivize entrepreneurialism and that fuel privatization. Under Duncan, we have greatly expanded a standards and testing regime that not only is shaping how we treat students, it's also shaping how we evaluate teachers, how we make decisions about school closures, and now even how we evaluate the universities that prepare those teachers. What we can argue, however, and what we can debate is whether or not these are good changes. And I think this is what our nation desperately needs right now. We can all acknowledge that these are big changes, that they have fundamentally changed the shape and the face of public education. What we need to be debating and arguing and contesting is whether these are actually good changes. Because what I want to argue is that the rhetoric behind school reform today may be very seductive. It may make us think that these changes are actually making things better in our nation's schools. But our responsibility as educators and as advocates is to make very stark the reality that these changes are actually making things much worse. So I wanted to begin by spend the first part of my presentation actually trying to name the moment that we're in. And I thought I would actually begin by talking about the moment regarding race and violence in our nation. And so I so appreciate, by the way, this conference's theme that forces us to think about the intersections of education and violence. And the way I want to talk about violence is actually by telling a story that maybe we don't often think about in terms of violence, and that is the drought here in California. I would argue, by the way, that this is great violence to our planet. It's also great violence to all living beings. But let's talk specifically about water. So here in California, every time we talk about the drought, we seem to be very focused on what individuals can do to reduce water usage. So every time we talk about the drought, we talk about how we need to take shorter showers, we need to stop watering our lawns and washing our cars, and we need to turn off the water in between wetting your toothbrush and rinsing your mouth, right? It's all about how we can all use less water. Okay. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the documentary that came out a few years ago. It's called, I was about to say it's Waiting for Superman. It's not Waiting for Superman, but it's made by the same person, Inconvenient Truth. So Inconvenient Truth is a film that featured Al Gore. It's all about climate change, and I loved about 99% of that film. Because for most of this documentary, they're trying to show us what are all the root or the systemic causes of climate change. But I don't know how many of you remember how this documentary ended. So at the very end of this documentary, there's a scroll, right? It basically says, all right, so now we've learned about how destructive and harmful climate change is. Let's now focus on what we can all do about it. And what can we all do about it? Well, we can all turn off our lights and carpool, and right, it's all about how individuals can consume less. This is one of the themes that I want to focus on today, is this contrast between the individual and the system. Because even when we talk about the drought, what we have to think about is how individual usage is nowhere near responsible for the drought or for climate change, right? Individual household consumption of water accounts for about 5% of water usage, right? Almonds, by the way, account for about, in this state, 10%. Alfalfa accounts for about 15%. And what's the biggest culprit? It's actually cow, beef, and dairy production, right? That accounts for about 47% of water usage. This is not what we talk about when we talk about climate change. We're not talking about the kind of agri-commerce, right, that is going almost unchecked in its use of water. What we do as a nation and as a state when we talk about droughts is we talk about individual responsibility. And what I want to argue is that when we individualize the problem, when we scapegoat individuals, we end up distracting from the much larger problem of the system. One of my heroes is the late Grace Lee Boggs. So those of you who are unfamiliar with Grace Lee Boggs, I highly encourage you to look her up. She celebrated recently her 100th birthday. She passed away about 4 days ago. There's a documentary made of her called American Revolution. It's the same title of her most recent book, I believe. And she is awesome. About a half a century ago, she was centrally involved in Black Power, Black liberation struggle. She is Chinese American and identifies as an ally, one who works in solidarity with different communities. One of the things that I found so powerful about Boggs's arguments is that we need to do more than simply critique. Now, she's a brilliant critic of what's going on in this world. She was steeped in neo-Marxist theory, right? So she thinks a lot about kind of structural problems of our economy and our nation. But in her later years, she began to argue that we not only need to be criticizing and critiquing what's wrong in our nation and in the world, we also need to be courageously imagining what could be different. And she would also argue that we not only need to be critiquing, and we not only need to be imagining, we also need to be enacting. There are many of us who are kind of the armchair activists, who are really good at sitting back and giving our great ideas about what's wrong and what we need to do differently. But we're not actually out there creating these changes. And by the way, that's one of the things that I love most about T4SJ. Because if you look at the various things that T4SJ does, they're actually supporting educators and advocates in bringing into the here and now very different ways of doing education, such as through your inquiry groups, such as through your public events, such as through supporting one another in doing very different kinds of teaching. Such a role model for what our professions should look like, and I so hope we see many more such organizations spring up. Boggs is arguing, turning to Boggs, that we need to reframe what we think it means to engage in social change. Let me talk then about one recent event that I think manifests or exemplifies some of these themes that I'm trying to talk about, and that is Ferguson. About half a year ago, the FBI released its report about the criminal justice system in Ferguson. I don't know how many of you are following this story, but I was listening to NPR when they were kind of summarizing what the report was. So the FBI director basically did a press conference, and he said, all right, we studied the criminal justice system in Ferguson, and what we found is that a central reason why these types of problems emerge is because there's a lot of unconscious bias. This is their language, right? There's a lot of individuals, particularly officers, particularly agents of the criminal justice system, who have internalized a lot of biases. And so what's the solution? We need to address bias. And it should not be surprising, he argued, that we all have some forms of unconscious bias, because that's the kind of a world we grow up in. We grow up in a society where we are surrounded by racist messages. Okay, so I'm listening to this press conference and I'm thinking, oh, I'm loving this idea. I'm so excited that the FBI would actually be talking about how we've all internalized stereotypes. So the very first commentator goes up and says, oh, I'm really unhappy with this report. And I thought, what, you're unhappy? What's going on here? And what the person goes on to say is that the problem with the FBI report is it reduced the problem of racism within criminal justice to biases of individuals. In other words, it individualized the problem of racism and the criminal justice system. And what that does, what the scapegoating of racist individuals does, is it masks the much larger problem of how the criminal justice system as a system is racialized and racist. So let's give an example of this. So the war on drugs is a great example, right? Because the war on drugs is all about how we criminalize the drug users and the drug pushers and the drug producers and all of that, right? Okay, let's think a little bit about drugs, however, because there are many drugs we know that are illegal to use. What we need to do, however, when we look at the criminalization of drug use is to see how the criminalizing processes have a stark differentiation between the types of drugs and the penalties for those usages. Right? Certain drugs are used more commonly in, let's say, urban contexts versus in the suburbs. Certain drugs are more likely to be persecuted by police officers. In other words, we're far more likely to go after the users of certain drugs versus of other drugs. And even when we break that down and we look at who's getting arrested, we see that certain drugs lead to jail time, whereas other drugs lead to monetary fines. And the users of the drugs that are more likely to be arrested and that are more likely to end up in jail tend to be black and brown users in urban contexts versus middle-class whites in the suburbs. Here, I think, is a perfect example of how the war on drugs is less about punishing criminals and more about criminalizing particular populations. It is the system that we need to be looking at, not only the individuals. With both the drought and with Ferguson, one of the main ideas that I'm trying to get at is not only that we need to contrast the individual and the system, but also that we need to contrast the rhetoric that we hear versus the reality behind that rhetoric. Right? What are the narratives that we are hearing, that we are surrounded by, and what reality is masked when we buy into those narratives? Let me name a few individuals that I want to use to further complicate my story about violence. Tanisha Anderson, Rakia Boyd, Miriam Carey, Alexia Christian, Michelle Cusseau, Shelley Frey, Maya Hall, Megan Hockaday, Kyan Livingston, Kayla Moore, and Sandra Bland. The Black Lives Matter movement was catapulted into a national movement, primarily under the leadership of 3 African-American women. But the names that are often associated with the victims of police violence tend to be African-American men. And so it was a really powerful movement that emerged this summer called the Say Her Name movement, which really focused on the invisibility of black women when it comes to violence under the criminal justice system. And Farima's fantastic presentation actually highlighted some of that. What I hear from the organizers of the Say Her Name movement isn't that the Black Lives Matter movement is fundamentally flawed. What I hear instead them saying is that any movement is going to be partial. That any movement will be helpful in some ways and not helpful in others. It will be including of some people and not so inclusive of others. It'll help us to make certain kinds of changes, and it'll prevent us from making other kinds of changes. In other words, even activist movements are partial, which is why larger movements, larger social changes require acting in solidarity. Right? We are not only about looking after ourselves, nor are we about trying to help, or trying to save, or trying to empower other people. Our role is to walk and act in solidarity, particularly with those communities that struggle the most, and to claim those struggles as my struggles. That is what it means to act in solidarity, and that is what we need to do. So let me apply some of these themes then. Rhetoric versus reality, the individual versus the system, and activist movements as partial, as I now turn to some current events in education, as I want to try to unmask what is some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, and what's the reality that's actually being hidden by these narratives. Let me talk about what's going on here in San Francisco in terms of the teacher shortage. Let me talk about cities around the country in terms of teacher strikes. And then let me talk at the national level about the next Secretary of Education. So in San Francisco, we are following, those of you who are from the Bay Area, in the late summer, we got a lot of media coverage about this historically large shortage of teachers in the San Francisco public schools. We expected about 500 openings, and as of a month before the school year was to begin, about 20% of those openings were still unfilled. So what's the rhetoric around teacher shortage? Well, the rhetoric is that we always knew this was coming. right? And those of us in the education circle, you probably remember that about 15 years ago, we were saying exactly this, that the retiring baby boomer population was going to hit the teaching force right around now. And we knew that right around now, we were going to have all these vacancies. All right, so the rhetoric is, oh, this was just sort of coming, we maybe didn't prepare ourselves as well as we needed to. Okay. What is the reality around the teacher shortage? The reality is that the majority, really the vast majority of those openings were not the result of retirement. The reality is that every year in San Francisco, as well as in pretty much every large urban diverse district, there are shortages. In fact, every year in every year in San Francisco for the past few years, we have had about 300 to 400 teacher openings, right? This year it's 500. It is bigger, but let's not use that as an excuse to overlook the reality that in urban contexts, schools are hard to staff. There is great teacher turnover, and there's lots of reasons why. Right? Lots of reasons that we overlook if all we're saying is that all of a sudden now there's a problem that we were not prepared for. In San Francisco, the teacher shortage is also being driven by the reality that many people cannot afford to live either in the city or even nearby. In Chicago, we saw something very similar where gentrification went hand in hand with school closures, right? The radical refacing, the radical reshaping of public education has everything to do with the widening disparities of our economic system. Let's also think about how the shortage is something that is being exacerbated by one thing that many urban districts are using as the solution. And that is, who are they hiring to replace the retiring teachers? If you replace teachers who have been teaching for 1, 2, or 3 decades with teachers who are telling you from the beginning that they will teach for maybe 1, 2, or 3 years, you're building a system where every year, necessarily so, you will have more openings. Right? The solution of replacing teachers with short-term teachers is not a solution that can possibly build capacity of our nation's public schools. But what I would argue is perhaps the biggest reason why we're seeing a growing number of shortages in urban areas is because many of the so-called reforms in education are actually making it harder and harder to teach. I like to tell people to think about the people that you think of as the most memorable teachers from your time growing up. And were these most memorable teachers the ones who were really good at getting you ready for a test? Or were they ones who were really, really rigorous and really creative and really able to relate to you and able to do something outside of the box? They were incredibly compassionate. They were incredibly committed. These are not the kinds of teachers necessarily that we hold up as the poster child of this next generation of teachers that are flooding into our nation's public schools, like in Philadelphia, like in New Orleans, where we are dismantling the public sector and greatly privatizing everything that's going on. The reforms such as high-stakes testing not only require that we spend more time testing and preparing for those tests, it also requires that we cut out everything else, and sometimes we even tell teachers what they're supposed to be doing with scripted curriculums. In other words, we're making teaching more about simply following a script and not actually doing what we know is most impactful for the learning and the lives of our children.